I want to be clear about something before I start. I'm not a paranoid person. I don't browse conspiracy forums. I've never once looked up at the sky and thought something was watching me. I'm a structural maintenance engineer. I spent 11 years inspecting load-bearing walls in government buildings across the Southwest, and the only thing I ever believed in was rebar spacing and concrete curing times. So when I tell you what I experienced at the Eldridge Continuity Facility, I need you to understand that I fought against believing it every single step of the way. The assignment came through my contracting firm in late October. The Department of Energy, working through 2 layers of intermediary agencies, needed a replacement SME for a 90-day rotation at an underground facility in Nye County, Nevada. The previous engineer had left early, personal reasons, according to the paperwork. The pay was extraordinary. Nearly triple my usual rate, with a completion bonus that could have covered 6 months of mortgage payments. There was a catch, naturally. The facility was residential. I'd be living on-site for the full 3 months with no surface access except for scheduled resupply windows every 2 weeks. No personal electronics past the entry checkpoint. No outside communication except for pre-approved, monitored letters. My wife, Dana, thought I was insane. We sat at our kitchen table in Flagstaff while she read through the contract, and she kept looking up at me like I was speaking another language. "You're going to live underground for 3 months," she said, not as a question. I told her it was essentially a maintenance posting. Check the structural integrity, monitor the HVAC and water systems, file reports. She asked why they were paying so much for something so routine. I didn't have an answer for her then. I do now. They sent a car for me on November 4th. A black Suburban with government plates and a driver who didn't introduce himself. We drove north from Las Vegas, past Indian Springs, past the turnoff for Mercury, and then onto a dirt road that didn't appear on any map I'd ever studied. The desert out there doesn't look like the postcards. There's no romance to it. It's flat and pale and it stretches out so far in every direction that your eyes start inventing shapes on the horizon just to have something to focus on. We drove for 40 minutes on that road without passing a single structure. The surface installation was modest, disappointing, even. A cluster of beige prefabricated buildings behind a double perimeter of chain link and razor wire. 2 guard shacks. A helicopter pad with faded markings. The kind of place that looked like it had been built in a hurry 40 years ago and then forgotten about. The driver pulled up to the main gate, handed my papers to a guard who barely glanced at them, and then drove me to a squat concrete structure that looked like an oversized electrical substation. There was a single steel door in the side, no windows, and a keycard reader that the driver swiped without a word. Inside, there was an elevator. Just one. Industrial, heavy gauge, the kind rated for moving equipment. The driver pressed the button for sub-level 1 and the car began to descend. It took longer than I expected, nearly a full minute of steady downward motion. When the doors opened, I was standing at the entrance to what I can only describe as a small underground town. The Eldridge Continuity Facility was built in 1968 as part of a program most people have never heard of. Not the famous ones, not Mount Weather, not Raven Rock, not the Greenbrier bunker under that resort in West Virginia. Eldridge was further down the list, a regional node in a network designed to ensure some version of the federal government could survive a full-scale nuclear exchange. It was meant to house 80 people for up to 18 months. By the time I arrived, it had been continuously occupied for over 30 years, though the population had dwindled to about 45 residents, a mix of military personnel, civilian contractors, and a handful of people whose roles I was never able to determine clearly. The main level was laid out along a central corridor roughly 400 meters long, with residential quarters branching off to the left and functional spaces, the cafeteria, medical bay, recreation room, operations center, to the right. The ceilings were 9 feet high, which was generous for a bunker, and someone had made an effort to make the place livable. The walls were painted in muted earth tones. There were potted plants under grow lights, a small library with actual wooden shelves, even a few framed prints of landscapes that seemed almost cruel in their reminder of the surface world. The air smelled like recirculated nothing, not bad, exactly, but absent in a way that made you aware of every breath you took. I was met by the facility administrator, a man named Lyle Corwin. He was in his late 50s, heavy-set, with the careful politeness of someone who had spent decades managing people in enclosed spaces. He showed me to my quarters, a room roughly the size of a budget hotel suite, with a bed, a desk, a small bathroom, and a ventilation grate that hummed at a frequency I could feel in my back teeth. He handed me a binder containing my duties, a map of the facility, and a laminated card with emergency procedures. "You'll find your way around quickly," he said. "It's not complicated. Most of the systems are automated. Your job is to make sure the structure itself stays sound. We've got some aging concrete in the lower sections, a few moisture issues near the water treatment plant. Nothing urgent." He paused at the door. "People here are friendly. But they're also private. We've all been down here a while. Give folks their space, and they'll give you yours." I unpacked, read through the binder, and went to the cafeteria for dinner. That's where I met most of the residents for the first time, and that's where the first thing happened that I couldn't explain. The cafeteria was about half full. People sat in small clusters, eating and talking quietly. A woman named Ree, she ran the commissary, waved me over and introduced me to a few people. There was Darren, a communications specialist who had been there for 4 years. June, a medical officer with a laugh that seemed too big for the space. Tom Aldis, an older man who handled water treatment and spoke in a slow, deliberate cadence, like every sentence was being composed for the first time. They were warm. Genuinely welcoming. Darren asked about the surface, not eagerly, but politely, the way you might ask about a country you'd visited once and didn't plan to return to. I was eating and half listening to June tell a story about the facility's one and only cat, a tabby named Gristle who had been smuggled in during a resupply 6 years ago, when I heard it for the first time. It was low. So low that I didn't hear it so much as feel it, a rhythmic pulse that came up through the floor, through the metal legs of my chair, and settled somewhere in my sternum. Not mechanical, not like the HVAC or the generators. It had a pattern to it, but not a regular one. 3 slow beats, then a pause, then 2 quicker ones, then silence. Then it would start again, slightly different, as if something was adjusting, trying variations. It lasted maybe 15 seconds. I looked up. No one at the table had reacted. June was still talking. Darren was nodding along. "Did you feel that?" I said. The table went quiet. Not dramatically, no one froze or exchanged panicked looks. It was subtler than that. A brief, collective stillness, like the moment between a lightning flash and thunder. Then June picked up her story exactly where she'd left off, and Darren took a sip of his coffee, and the conversation resumed as if I hadn't spoken. I told myself it was the ventilation system. Some deep harmonic resonance from the air handlers or the water pumps. In a facility this size, buried this deep in bedrock, you get strange acoustic effects. Sound travels through stone in ways that can seem almost organic. I wrote it off and finished my dinner. That night, lying in my bunk with the lights off, I heard it again. This time it was clearer. The silence of the sleeping facility stripped away the ambient noise that had partially masked it in the cafeteria, and I could hear the actual sound beneath the vibration. It wasn't just a pulse. There was a texture to it, something almost tonal, like a voice trying to form words through a medium that wasn't air. It rose and fell in a pattern that was too irregular to be mechanical but too consistent to be random. I lay there and listened for what must have been 20 minutes. It never stopped. It just faded in and out of perception, as if it existed right at the threshold of what human hearing could process. I got up and put my hand on the floor. The concrete was vibrating. Faintly, but unmistakably. And the vibration was coming from below. I checked my facility map. According to the layout, my quarters were on sublevel 1. Below me was sublevel 2, which housed the mechanical plant, generators, water treatment, HVAC, electrical distribution. Below that, according to the map, was nothing. Bedrock. The facility was a two-level structure sitting in an excavated cavern in the desert substrate. But the sound wasn't coming from sublevel 2. I'd spent enough years working in buildings to know the difference between mechanical vibration traveling horizontally and something resonating from directly underneath. This was deeper. Whatever was making that sound was below the lowest level of the facility. The next morning I went to the operations center and asked Lyle Corwin about the sublevels. He was eating a granola bar and reading a technical manual, and he looked up at me with an expression I would later come to recognize as rehearsed. 2 levels, he said. Main level and the mechanical plant. That's it. I'm hearing something from below the mechanical level, I said. A vibration. Low frequency, intermittent. It might be a geological issue, subsidence, maybe, or an underground water channel interacting with the foundation. The geology out here is stable, Lyle said. That's why they built the facility here. You might be hearing the deep well pumps. They pull from an aquifer about 800 feet down, and sometimes the resonance carries. It was a plausible answer. I almost accepted it. But there was something about the way he delivered it, too smooth, too immediate, as if he'd given this exact explanation before and had it polished to a shine. And he'd answered without asking me to describe the sound, without asking when I'd heard it or where. In my experience, when you tell an engineer about an unusual noise, their first question is always, what did it sound like? Lyle hadn't asked, because he already knew. I spent my first week settling into the routine. The structural work was straightforward. I inspected concrete surfaces for cracking and spalling, checked expansion joints, monitored the humidity levels in various sections. The facility was in reasonable shape for its age, though there were areas where moisture intrusion had started to compromise the aggregate bond. I wrote reports, submitted them through the internal system, and received terse acknowledgments from whoever was reading them on the other end. During that week, I heard the noise every night. And I started noticing things about the residents. They were, as Lyle had said, friendly. But their friendliness had a specific character to it. It was wide but not deep. People would talk to you at length about food, about books, about the small dramas of communal living. Darren could go on for an hour about signal propagation theory. June would happily discuss any medical topic you could name. But there were subjects that simply didn't exist in conversation. No one talked about why they were there. No one talked about the facility's purpose in anything but the vaguest terms. And no one, not once, in my entire first week, mentioned the noise. This wasn't natural. In any enclosed living situation, ambient sounds become a primary topic of conversation. People complain about the HVAC, about someone snoring, about the particular whine of a fluorescent ballast. In the Eldridge facility, where sound had nowhere to go and every noise was magnified by the enclosed space, people discussed the hum of the generators, the distant clang of pipes, the way the ventilation sometimes whistled through the corridor junctions. They discussed all of these sounds. But not the one that came from below. The one that you could feel in your bones every single night. The one that was, by any objective measure, the most prominent and unusual sound in the entire facility. I brought it up 3 more times during that first week. Each time, I got the same response, not denial, exactly, but a smooth redirection that left me feeling like I'd committed a social error. Changed the subject to the supply manifest. Tom Aldous looked at me for a long moment, then started talking about water filtration rates. Darren laughed and said the desert played tricks on your ears, even underground. On the 8th night, I went down to sublevel 2. The mechanical plant was a sprawling space, low ceilings, exposed conduit, the constant drone of the generators and the rhythmic chug of the water pumps. It was warmer down there, and the air had a faintly metallic taste. I walked the entire level with a flashlight, checking the floor. In the northeast corner, past the secondary generator bank, I found what I was looking for. The floor in that section was different. The rest of the mechanical level was poured concrete over bedrock, but this section had been covered with heavy steel plates, bolted down, sealed at the edges with industrial caulking that had been applied in multiple layers over what looked like many years. The plates were roughly 4 feet by 8 feet, arranged in a grid that covered an area of about 30 by 40 feet. They were painted the same gray as the surrounding floor, and if you weren't looking for them, you'd walk right over them. I knelt down and pressed my palm against one of the plates. The vibration was immediate and strong. The sound was clearer here, not just a pulse, but a complex, layered thing. I could distinguish at least 3 separate frequencies interweaving. And underneath them, barely perceptible, something that sounded almost like breathing. Slow. Vast. The kind of breathing you'd expect from lungs the size of a room. I checked the bolts on the nearest plate. They were massive, 3/4-inch hex heads, countersunk and sealed with weld beads that had been ground smooth. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to make sure these plates didn't come up. I looked at the caulking more closely. The newest layer was relatively fresh, months old, not years. Someone was maintaining these seals. I went back to my quarters and pulled out the facility binder. The map showed sub-level 2 as a single undivided space. There was no indication of the steel plates, no annotation about a sealed section, no reference to anything below the mechanical level. I flipped through the emergency procedures. Evacuation routes led up, to sub-level 1 and then to the surface elevator. There was no mention of any downward route. As far as the official documentation was concerned, the facility ended at the mechanical level floor. But the building told a different story. I'd been inspecting structures long enough to read concrete like other people read books. The load-bearing walls on sub-level 2 were over-engineered, thicker than necessary for a 2-level structure, with reinforcement patterns that suggested they were designed to bear weight not just from above, but from below. The foundation wasn't just sitting on bedrock. It was anchored into it, with what I estimated were pilings driven at least 30 feet deep. This facility had been built to resist upward force. Something underneath was expected to push. I started looking for the original blueprints. The operations center had a filing room with technical documentation going back to the facility's construction, but the structural drawings I found were incomplete. The foundation plans were missing. The geological survey was missing. Everything relating to what was beneath the mechanical level had been removed from the files, and the gaps weren't even subtle. You could see the empty hanging folders, the index entries with no corresponding documents. I asked Lyle about the missing files. He told me that older documentation had been archived off-site for preservation. He said it with the same smooth delivery, the same faint non-expression that I was beginning to understand was the facility's native language. Not lies, exactly. Just answers shaped to fill the space where a question had been, leaving no room for follow-up. It was on the 12th night that the noise changed. I was in the mechanical plant again, crouched beside the steel plates with a contact microphone I'd improvised from a piezoelectric element and a pair of maintenance headphones. The sound through the contact mic was extraordinary, rich and dense, with harmonics that seemed to fold over each other in patterns that my brain kept trying to interpret as language. I'd been listening for about 10 minutes when I whispered something. I don't even remember what, something meaningless, maybe just a reflexive murmur. An okay, or a what the hell. The sound stopped. Not faded. Not wound down. Stopped. Complete silence from below the plates. Even the constant baseline vibration I'd grown accustomed to, the one I could feel through the floor at all hours, went still. It was like the entire mass of rock beneath me had been holding its breath and suddenly let go. I froze. The silence was worse than the noise. The noise, however strange, had been something I could analyze, measure, approach rationally. The silence was aware. That's the only word I can use. It was the silence of something that had just noticed me. 5 seconds. 10. I didn't move. Then it came back, but different. The rhythm had changed. The previous pattern, those cycling, almost conversational cadences, was gone. In its place was something slower and more deliberate. A single sustained tone that rose gradually in pitch over several seconds, then dropped, then rose again. And it was louder. Not dramatically, but enough that I could feel it in my joints. I ripped off the headphones and backed away from the plates. As I did, the tone shifted, pitched up slightly, almost questioningly, as if responding to my movement. I stopped. It steadied. I took another step back. It shifted again. I left the mechanical level and didn't go back for 3 days. During those 3 days, I watched the other residents more carefully than ever. I watched their routines, their interactions, the things they did and didn't do. And I noticed something I'd somehow missed before. No one went to the northeast section of sublevel 2. The mechanical plant was part of several people's daily responsibilities. Tom maintained the water systems. A quiet man named Greaves handled the generators. Re-inventoried supplies that were stored in the southern portion of the level. They all moved through the space regularly. But their paths never took them past the secondary generator bank, never brought them within 50 feet of the steel plates. They moved around that section the way water moves around a stone, naturally, without apparent effort, as if their routes had been shaped by long habit into patterns that avoided that corner completely. And at night, when the noise was at its most present, people stayed in their quarters. The corridors emptied after 10 o'clock as if by curfew, though no curfew existed. The cafeteria, which during the day was the social center of the facility, sat dark and abandoned through the overnight hours. People retreated into their small rooms and closed their doors and presumably lay in their bunks and felt the vibration come up through the floor just like I did. Alone. In silence. Never acknowledging it. On the 15th night, someone came to my room. It was just past midnight. The noise was present, that new, slower pattern it had adopted since the night I'd spoken near the plates. I was lying awake, as had become my habit, when I heard a soft knock. I opened the door to find June standing in the corridor. She was wearing a sweater over her sleepwear, and she looked smaller than she did during the day, diminished somehow, as if the facility's overhead lighting had been lending her a vitality that the dim nighttime corridors took away. "Can I come in?" she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I let her in. She sat on the edge of my desk chair and didn't speak for nearly a minute. I waited. "You need to stop going downstairs," she said finally. "You know about the noise." "Of course I know about the noise. Everyone knows about the noise. We've all always known about the noise." "Then why?" "Because knowing about it and talking about it are two very different things." She looked at me, and in the low light I could see that her eyes were red-rimmed. Not from crying, from exhaustion. The kind of deep, structural exhaustion that builds over years. "Martin. I've been here for 9 years. Tom's been here for 14. Lyle's been here since the beginning. Not the beginning of his rotation. The beginning. When they reopened the facility in '93. He's been underground for over 30 years. Why? Why would anyone? Because someone has to be here. That's the job. That's the only job that actually matters in this facility. Not the generators, not the water, not the comms equipment. We're here because someone has to be here. Above it. Above what? She pressed her lips together and shook her head. Not a refusal, more like the physical expression of a thought she couldn't bring herself to complete. "The man you replaced. Aldrich. He was like you. He asked questions. He went down to the plates. He brought tools." She paused. "He started sleeping on the mechanical level. Said he could hear it better down there. Said it was trying to communicate." "What happened to him?" "He opened one of the plates." The way she said it, flat, quiet, final, made the hair on my arms stand up. Not because of what the words meant, but because of the way her voice carried the weight of something she'd witnessed and could never adequately describe. What was underneath? I asked. I don't know. I wasn't there. Greaves found him the next morning. The plate had been pried up and set aside. Aldrich was sitting next to the opening, cross-legged, facing down into it. He was alive. He was breathing. But he wasn't present. His eyes were open, but they weren't focused on anything in this world. We couldn't get him to speak, couldn't get him to eat. He just sat there, staring down. When they finally moved him, it took 4 people, he didn't resist, but he kept turning his head back toward the opening, like a compass needle finding north. Where is he now? They took him to the surface. I don't know what happened after that. Lyle filed the report and told us the plate had been resealed. Told us Aldrich had experienced a psychological break due to isolation stress. And that was it. No one brought it up again. And the plate? Resealed. New bolts, new welds. Lyle did it himself. He was down there for 9 hours. I sat with that for a while. The noise pulsed beneath us, slow, patient, immense. June. What is this facility? What's really going on here? She stood up and walked to the door. With her hand on the handle, she turned back. The facility was built in 68. But the excavation started in 61. They were digging something out of the bedrock, or trying to. They dug for 3 years before they realized they couldn't remove it. Whatever it is, it goes down further than they could reach. Further than their equipment could measure. So they stopped trying to dig it out and built on top of it instead. She opened the door. We're not sheltering in a bunker, Martin. We're sitting on a cork. She left. I didn't sleep. The next morning I went to the filing room in the operations center and searched again for anything I might have missed. In a drawer of miscellaneous technical documents, wiring diagrams, HVAC calibration logs, I found a single page that had been misfiled. It was a fragment of a geological survey dated March 1963. Most of it was technical, bore sample data, soil composition, compressive strength readings, but in the margin, someone had written a note in pencil. The handwriting was cramped and hurried. Anomaly extends below maximum drill depth, 340 m. Composition does not match any known geological formation. Sample analysis inconclusive, material appears to beat organic in origin. Team recommends abandoning excavation and implementing permanent containment protocol. Dr. Hargrove dissents, requests permission to continue. Organic. The word sat in my mind like a splinter. 340 meters below the surface, someone had found something organic. Not mineral, not geological. Something that had once been, or still was, alive. I went to find Tom Aldis. He was in the water treatment area, checking gauges with the same unhurried attention he brought to everything. I stood in the doorway and watched him for a moment before he acknowledged me. You talked to June, he said without looking up. She told me about Aldrich. Aldrich was a good man. Smart. Too smart for his own well-being. Tom finished his reading and wrote something on a clipboard. Then he set it down and looked at me for the first time. His eyes were clear and steady and terribly sad. You want to know what I think is down there? Yes. I don't think about what's down there. That's how I've survived 14 years in this hole. I do my work. I maintain the water systems. I eat dinner in the cafeteria and I read books, and once a week I play chess with Greaves, and I do not think about what is below us. He picked up the clipboard again. The people who think about it are the ones who go down to the plates. And the people who go down to the plates are the ones who leave in the back of a medical transport with a needle in their arm and a stare that goes about 4,000 miles past the horizon. Doesn't it bother you? Living on top of something you don't understand? Tom looked at me, and for just a moment, his composure cracked. What I saw underneath wasn't fear, exactly. It was something older and more resigned. Acceptance, maybe. The acceptance of a man who had weighed his options a long time ago and decided that some questions are better left as questions. "Martin," he said. "I've been here for 14 years. I've listened to that sound every single night for 14 years. You want to know what I've learned? It's not trying to communicate. It's not intelligent, not in any way we'd recognize. It's more like weather. Like a tide. It moves, it cycles, it patterns. Sometimes it's loud, sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it changes when there are new people in the facility, like it can sense the weight shifting above it. But it's not aware. Not really. Then why does it respond? When I was near the plates, it reacted to my voice. To my movement. Something shifted in Tom's expression. He set the clipboard down again, slowly this time. It responded to you? Yes. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, very carefully, "It's never done that before. Not for Aldrich. Not for anyone, as far as I know. The sound has always been consistent. Background. Like tinnitus." He looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. How did it respond? I told him about the silence. About the shift in the pattern, the way the tone had tracked my movement. As I spoke, I watched his face drain of something, not color, but certainty. The foundation of whatever piece he'd built for himself over 14 years was developing cracks. "You should leave," he said. "Request a transfer. Tell Lyle you're having anxiety, claustrophobia, whatever you need to say. Get on the next resupply vehicle and don't come back. I have a contract. Forget the contract. Forget the money. This isn't," he stopped himself. Took a breath. When he spoke again, his voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it that trembled. "In 14 years, it has never responded to a person. It has never changed its pattern because someone was near the plates. If it's reacting to you, if it knows you're here, then something has changed. And changes down here are not good." That night, I made a decision that I have spent every day since regretting. I went to the mechanical level at 2 a.m. The facility was silent, that human silence of closed doors and held breaths that I had come to recognize as the nightly ritual of collective denial. I brought a wrench, a pry bar, and a headlamp. I walked past the generators, past the water treatment plant, past the point where every other resident's path curved away like a stream around a boulder, and I stood on the steel plates. The noise was immediate. Not the gradual swell I'd become accustomed to, but a sudden, full-throated presence, as if it had been waiting. The pattern was different again, faster, more complex, layered with harmonics that made my vision blur at the edges. I could feel it in my teeth, in the bones of my skull, in the fluid of my inner ear. It wasn't painful. It was intimate. As if something enormous was pressing its mouth to the other side of the floor and whispering. I selected a plate near the center of the grid and examined the bolts. They were heavy, but they were just bolts. The weld beads would need to be ground off first, and that would make noise. I didn't care. I took the pry bar and began working on the caulking around the edge of the plate, peeling back layers of sealant that came away in thick, rubbery strips. Under the newest layer, I found older caulking, then older still, then something that wasn't caulking at all, a dark, semi-rigid substance that I didn't recognize. It was slightly warm to the touch. As I worked, the sound from below intensified. The complex pattern dissolved into a single sustained frequency that I felt more than heard, a vibration that seemed to synchronize with my heartbeat, speeding up when mine did, slowing when I paused. I was aware, in a detached and clinical way, that I should be terrified. I wasn't. What I felt was something closer to compulsion. A gravitational pull, intellectual and physical simultaneously, drawing me toward whatever was underneath. I had cleared the caulking and was starting on the first bolt when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned. Lyle Corwin was standing at the edge of the plated area, fully dressed, his face lit from below by my headlamp's reflected glow. He looked old. Older than he should have. The careful administrator I'd met on my first day was gone, and in his place was a man who carried something so heavy that it had compressed him, year by year, into a denser and more fragile version of himself. "Put down the tools, Martin," he said. Not a command. A plea. "What's down there, Lyle?" He walked toward me slowly, his footsteps loud on the steel plates. As he got closer, I saw that his hands were shaking. "I've been down here for 31 years, he said. 31 years on top of this thing. I've watched people come and go. I've watched them hear the sound, ask the questions, push against the silence. Some of them let it go. They settle in, they accept the noise as background, they learn to sleep through it. Those are the ones who survive. Who stay sane." He stopped a few feet from me. "And then there are the ones like you. The ones it notices. Tom said it's never responded to anyone before. Tom doesn't know everything. Tom's been here 14 years. I've been here 31. Lyle reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a laminated photograph. He held it out to me. I took it. It was an old photo, Polaroid, faded, from the early 90s. It showed the mechanical level, recognizable by the conduit and the generator housings. But the steel plates weren't there. Instead, there was an opening in the floor, a rough-edged hole about 20 feet across, descending into darkness. At the edge of the hole, 3 people in military uniforms were standing with flashlights pointed downward. The quality was poor, but I could make out their expressions. They weren't looking down with curiosity or professional assessment. They were looking down with the fixed, wide-eyed stillness of people who were seeing something that their brains had no category for. "That was taken in '93, Lyle said. When the DOE reopened the facility. The original project in the '60s, they tried to excavate it, study it, contain it. They failed. The facility was sealed in '72 and abandoned. When we came back in '93, it was because satellite imaging showed thermal anomalies at the site. The thing underneath was generating heat. More heat than it had in the '60s. It was growing. Growing. Or waking up. We don't know. We've never known. The teams that went down, the first ones, in the '60s, they sent people into the opening with ropes and lights. They went down about 200 feet before they lost contact. Not radio contact, psychological contact. The people who came back up weren't the same. They could function, mostly. Walk, eat, breathe. But something was missing. Something had been taken or replaced or overridden. They'd just stand sometimes, in the middle of a conversation, and tilt their heads toward the floor, listening. One of them started writing. Filled notebooks with symbols that no one could read, in handwriting that wasn't hers. I looked at the photograph again. The darkness in that hole was absolute. Not the darkness of an unlit room, but something denser, something that seemed to push back against the flashlight beams that were aimed into it. The plates went down in '94, Lyle continued. 6 inches of steel, welded and bolted and sealed. Then another layer underneath, lead, concrete, then a polymer barrier that was supposed to block whatever energy the thing emits. We've been resealing them every few years since then. Every time, the caulking degrades faster. Every time, the bolts need to be tighter. He took the photograph back from me. And the whole time, we sit here. On top of it. Because the research from the '60s concluded one thing definitively: the presence of living human beings above it keeps it dormant. Not inactive. Dormant. There's a difference. When the facility was abandoned between '72 and '93, the thermal output tripled. The seismic activity increased. The thing was waking up. When we came back and repopulate the facility, it settled. Why? Why would human presence? We don't know. The best theory anyone ever offered was that it feeds on something we emit, bioelectric fields, body heat, neural activity, something. And as long as it's being fed, it sleeps. Or at least, it stays still. Lyle's voice was steady now, reciting facts he'd lived with for 3 decades. That's why we're here, Martin. That's the real purpose of the facility. Not continuity of government. Not emergency preparedness. We're the meal. The lullaby. The thing that keeps it from doing whatever it would do if it woke up completely. And no one asks about the noise, I said. Because asking means thinking about it. And thinking about it. Thinking about it is a form of contact. The more attention you pay to it, the more it pays attention to you. That's what happened to Aldrich. That's what happened to the teams in the 60s. That's what's happening to you right now. He looked at the plate where I'd been working. It responded to you because you were already listening. Most people hear the noise and their brains categorize it, background, ambient, ignorable. But some people can't ignore it. Some people's minds reach toward it, and when they do, it reaches back. I looked down at the plate. The bolt I'd been working on had turned nearly a 1/4 inch. The caulking was stripped. Through the hairline gap at the plate's edge, I could feel air moving, warm air, rising from below, carrying a smell that was both utterly alien and strangely, nauseatingly familiar. Like iron and ozone and the scent of soil after rain, but twisted, concentrated, ancient. I need you to step away from the plates, Lyle said. I need you to go back to your quarters and pack your things. The resupply vehicle comes in 3 days. You'll be on it. I should have listened. Every rational part of my mind was screaming at me to listen. But the noise, the sound from below, had shifted again. It was doing something it had never done before, not in all the nights I'd lain awake listening to it. It was producing a frequency that I could not just feel but understand. Not words. Not language. Something more fundamental than language. A direct transmission of meaning that bypassed my ears entirely and arrived fully formed in the center of my thoughts. It was grateful. That's the only way I can describe it. The thing below the plates, the thing in the dark, the thing that went down further than anyone had ever measured, it was grateful that someone was finally paying attention. Not investigating, not studying, not trying to contain or understand. Just listening. Acknowledging. After decades of being deliberately ignored by the people living on top of it, someone had finally turned toward it instead of away. And in that gratitude, I felt something else. Something that made me grab my tools and step back from the plates so fast that I tripped over a conduit and fell hard on the concrete. I felt hunger. Not my hunger. Its hunger. A vast, patient, geological hunger that had been building for longer than human civilization. The thing beneath the bunker wasn't dormant. It wasn't sleeping. It was digesting. Slowly, imperceptibly, over decades, it was consuming the living energy of every person who had ever resided in the facility, drawing off the bioelectric hum of human consciousness like a tree drawing nutrients from the soil. The people weren't keeping it asleep. They were keeping it fed. And it was growing. Year by year, decade by decade, it was growing larger, extending deeper and further, spreading through the bedrock beneath the Nevada desert like a root system made of something that had never been alive in any way that biology could account for. The noise wasn't communication. It wasn't an attempt to reach out. It was digestion. The sound we heard through the floor every night was the sound of something eating. Lyle helped me to my feet. His face told me he knew. Not what I'd felt specifically, but he knew the general shape of it. He'd known for 31 years. Now you understand, he said, why no one asks. I left the facility 3 days later, on the resupply vehicle, just as Lyle had arranged. I sat in the back of an armored truck and watched the desert floor bounce and blur through a small window, and I didn't speak to anyone for the entire drive back to Las Vegas. They flew me to Flagstaff. Dana picked me up at the airport. She said I looked like I'd aged 10 years. I told her the posting hadn't agreed with me. She didn't push. That was 4 months ago. I haven't told anyone this story until now. Not because I'm afraid of being disbelieved, I've already accepted that no one will believe me. I'm telling it because of what's been happening since I left. The noise didn't stop when I came home. It's faint. Barely there. A whisper of vibration that I feel in the floor of my house in the early hours of the morning, when the world is quiet enough for it to reach me. It pulses in the same pattern, that new pattern, the one that started when it noticed me. Slow, deliberate, patient. It fades when the sun comes up and the noise of daily life drowns it out. But it's there. Every night. Getting slightly, imperceptibly louder. I've tried to rationalize it. Psychosomatic response, I tell myself. Residual trauma expressing itself as phantom sensation. My brain is pattern matching, finding familiar rhythms in the random vibrations of a house settling on its foundation. That's the rational explanation, and I cling to it the way a man in deep water clings to anything that floats. But 3 weeks ago, I was lying in bed at 2 a.m, listening to the faint pulse, and I whispered into the darkness without thinking. Just a breath. Just a word. I said, I hear you. And 2,000 miles away, beneath the floor of a bunker in the Nevada desert, beneath steel plates and lead barriers and 200 feet of bedrock, something answered. I don't know what it said. I don't think human language has the architecture to contain it. But I felt the meaning settle into me like sediment falling through water, and in the morning, when I went outside to get the paper, I noticed something I hadn't noticed before. There was a crack in my foundation. It was small. A hairline fracture in the concrete, running from the northeast corner of the house toward the center. I knelt down and put my hand on it. The concrete was warm. I haven't slept in 9 days. The noise is louder now, loud enough that Dana can hear it. She asked me last night if the furnace was making a new sound. I told her I'd look into it. She went to bed. I stayed up, sitting on the kitchen floor with my palm pressed flat against the tile, feeling the slow, rhythmic pulse of something vast and patient and impossibly hungry moving through the bones of the earth toward the only person who ever listened back. I think it's following me. I think it's under my house now. And the worst part, the part that keeps me sitting here in the dark, night after night, with my hand on the floor and my heart matching its rhythm, is that I'm not sure I want it to stop.